Sheriff Robert Jenkins pulled his patrol car to a stop at the corner of Elm and 5th Street. It was a cold night in this forgotten neighborhood of Millbrook, a small town in the United States. The streetlights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the cracked sidewalks. Robert had been the town's sheriff for over a decade, but this area always made him uneasy. As he stepped out of his car, the biting wind cut through his jacket. He adjusted his hat and started his nightly rounds, his footsteps echoing in the empty streets. The rundown buildings loomed over him, their windows dark and lifeless. Halfway down the block, a movement caught his eye. In a dimly lit alley between two dilapidated apartment buildings, a figure hunched over a makeshift washing station. Robert squinted, trying to make out the details. It was a young woman, her thin frame shivering as she scrubbed clothes in a bucket of soapy water. Robert approached cautiously, not wanting to startle her. "Evening, miss," he called out softly. "Everything all right?" The young woman's head snapped up, fear flashing across her face. She took a step back, her hands gripping a wet shirt tightly. I'm not doing anything wrong," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Robert held up his hands, showing he meant no harm. "I'm not here to cause trouble. Just checking to make sure you're okay. It's awfully cold to be doing laundry outside." The woman relaxed slightly but remained wary. "We don't have running water in our apartment," she explained, her eyes downcast. "The landlord, he won't fix the pipes." Robert's brow furrowed. "That's not right. How long has this been going on?" "Months," she replied, her shoulders slumping. "I'm Aisha, by the way. Robert Jenkins," he introduced himself. "I'm the sheriff here in Millbrook. Mind if we talk for a bit?" Aisha hesitated, then nodded. She gathered her wet clothes and gestured towards a nearby stoop. They sat down, the cold concrete seeping through their clothes. "So, Aisha," Robert began, "tell me about your situation. How long have you been living here?" Aisha sighed, her breath visible in the cold air. "About 2 years. My mom and I moved here after she got sick. It was all we could afford." As Aisha spoke, Robert noticed the deep sadness in her eyes. She told him about her mother's chronic illness, how it prevented her from working. Aisha had taken on odd jobs to make ends meet, but it was never enough. The landlord, a man named Frank Dawson, had promised to fix their apartment when they moved in, but nothing ever changed. "We're not the only ones," Aisha said, her voice gaining strength. "Most of the tenants here are struggling. Mr. Dawson, he doesn't care. He just collects the rent and ignores our complaints." Robert listened intently, his jaw clenching as Aisha described the deplorable conditions they were forced to live in. Leaky roofs, faulty wiring, pest infestations, the list seemed endless. "Have you considered reporting this to the authorities?" Robert asked. Aisha let out a bitter laugh. "And risk getting evicted? We have nowhere else to go, Sheriff. Besides, some of us, we're not exactly in a position to draw attention to ourselves." Robert understood the implication. In a town like Millbrook, undocumented immigrants often fell through the cracks, exploited by those who knew they couldn't fight back. "I'd like to see your apartment, if that's okay," Robert said after a moment of thought. "Maybe there's something I can do to help." Aisha hesitated, then nodded. She led Robert up a creaky staircase to the 3rd floor of the building. The hallway was dark, lit only by a single flickering bulb. The smell of mold and decay hung heavy in the air. Aisha unlocked the door to apartment 3C, and Robert stepped inside. What he saw made his stomach churn. The ceiling was stained with water damage, and chunks of plaster had fallen to the floor. A threadbare couch sat in the corner, its stuffing spilling out of torn seams. In the kitchenette, a single hot plate served as the only cooking appliance. A woman lay on a mattress in the corner, covered in thin blankets. She coughed weakly, and Aisha rushed to her side. "Mom, it's okay." This is Sheriff Jenkins. He's here to help." Robert approached the woman kneeling beside the mattress. Her skin was pale, her cheeks sunken. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry you're living like this. No one should have to endure these conditions." Aisha's mother tried to speak, but another coughing fit overtook her. Robert stood up, his mind racing. He couldn't leave these people, this whole community, to suffer like this. "Aisha," he said, turning to the young woman, "I want you to know that I'm going to do everything in my power to help you and your neighbors. This isn't right, and it needs to change." For the first time that night, a glimmer of hope appeared in Aisha's eyes. "You really mean that?" Robert nodded firmly. "I do. It won't be easy and it might take some time, but I promise you, we're going to make things better here." As Robert left the apartment building that night, he felt a newfound sense of purpose. He had always tried to be a good sheriff to protect and serve his community. But now he realized that true justice meant fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. The discovery of Aisha and her plight had opened his eyes to a world of suffering hidden in plain sight. As he drove back to the station, Robert began to formulate a plan. He would need allies, evidence, and courage to take on the corrupt landlord and the system that allowed such injustice to persist. But as he glanced back at the rundown building in his rearview mirror, Robert knew one thing for certain. He was committed to this fight, no matter the cost. The people of this forgotten neighborhood deserved better, and he was determined to help them get it. The morning after his encounter with Aisha, Sheriff Robert Jenkins sat at his desk, staring at a blank notepad. He needed a plan, but where to start? The scale of the problem seemed overwhelming. As he pondered his next move, his phone rang. "Sheriff Jenkins speaking," he answered. "Sheriff, this is Evelyn Martinez," a firm voice replied. "I hear you've been poking around Dawson's properties. We need to talk." Robert recognized the name. Evelyn Martinez was a longtime resident and unofficial community leader in the neighborhood he'd visited last night. He agreed to meet her at a local diner in an hour. The bell above the door jingled as Robert entered the diner. Evelyn waved him over to a booth in the corner. She was a stout woman in her 60s with graying hair and sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "Coffee?" she asked as Robert slid into the seat across from her. He nodded and she signaled the waitress. "So," Evelyn began once they were alone, "you met Aisha." Robert leaned forward. "You know her?" "I know everyone in that neighborhood, Sheriff. Someone has to look out for them, seeing as the city won't." Over the next hour, Evelyn filled Robert in on the extent of the problem. Frank Dawson owned most of the properties in the area, all in various states of disrepair. Complaints were ignored, and those who pushed too hard found themselves evicted. "It's not just the living conditions," Evelyn explained, her voice low. "Dawson's got connections. People who complain too loudly have a habit of getting in trouble with the law, if you catch my drift." Robert's jaw clenched. This was worse than he'd thought. Why hasn't anyone gone to the media or filed a lawsuit? Evelyn sighed. "Fear, mostly. A lot of the residents are undocumented. Others have records. They can't risk the exposure. And the few who could? Well, let's just say Dawson's made it clear that wouldn't end well for them." Robert sat back, processing the information. "We need to organize," he said finally. "Get everyone together, share information. If we can build a strong enough case, we might be able to force the city to take action." Evelyn studied him for a moment. "You're serious about this, aren't you? It won't be easy. Dawson's got friends in high places." "I took an oath to protect and serve," Robert replied firmly. "That includes everyone in this town, not just the wealthy and powerful." A small smile crossed Evelyn's face. "All right then, Sheriff. Let's see what we can do." Over the next week, Robert and Evelyn worked tirelessly to organize a community meeting. They spread the word quietly, careful not to attract unwanted attention. Robert used his position to gather what public records he could on Dawson's properties and business dealings. On the night of the meeting, Robert stood nervously at the front of a small church basement. Evelyn had assured him people would come, but as the start time approached, the room remained empty. Then, slowly, people began to trickle in. Families with young children, elderly couples, single adults. A cross-section of the neighborhood filled the chairs. Robert recognized Aisha, sitting near the back with her mother in a wheelchair beside her. As Evelyn called the meeting to order, Robert scanned the crowd. The fear was palpable, but so was a glimmer of hope. These people had been ignored and abused for too long. They were ready for change. Robert stepped up to address the group. "I know many of you are afraid," he began. "You have every right to be, but together we have a chance to make things better. Not just for ourselves, but for our entire community." He outlined what he'd learned about Dawson's operations and the legal options available to them. As he spoke, he saw people sitting up straighter, whispering to each other with growing excitement. Evelyn took over, organizing the attendees into committees. One group would document code violations in the buildings, another would gather testimonies from residents, a third would research Dawson's business connections. The energy in the room was building when suddenly the door burst open. A tall man with a weather-beaten face strode in, his eyes cold. "Well, well," he drawled. "Quite the little party you've got here." The room fell silent. Robert stepped forward. "This is a private meeting, sir. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The man smirked. "Oh, I'll leave. But first, let me make something clear to all of you." He raised his voice, addressing the crowd. "Mr. Dawson is a pillar of this community. He provides housing to those who'd otherwise be on the street. If you've got complaints, take them up with him directly. Start causing trouble, and you might find yourselves without a roof over your heads. Understand?" With that, he turned and left, slamming the door behind him. The silence that followed was deafening. Robert looked out at the sea of frightened faces. This was the moment that would determine everything. If they gave in to fear now, all hope of change would be lost. He took a deep breath. "That," he said loudly, "is exactly why we need to stand together. Dawson thinks he can intimidate us into silence. Are we going to let him?" For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, Aisha stood up. "No," she said firmly. "We're not." One by one, others began to stand. Evelyn stepped forward, her eyes blazing. "We've been quiet for too long," she declared. "It's time to fight back." As the meeting resumed with renewed determination, Robert felt a surge of pride. The road ahead would be difficult, but these people had taken the first crucial step. They had answered the call to action. The battle for justice in their forgotten corner of the city had begun. In the weeks following the community meeting, a sense of cautious optimism spread through the neighborhood. Despite the intimidation attempt, residents began to band together, sharing their stories and documenting the deplorable conditions of their living spaces. Robert Jenkins found himself at the center of this burgeoning movement. He spent his off-duty hours meeting with tenants, photographing code violations, and compiling a growing dossier of evidence against Frank Dawson. Evelyn Martinez proved to be an invaluable ally, her deep connections in the community opening doors that might otherwise have remained shut. One evening, as Robert and Evelyn pored over a stack of complaints in her small apartment, she leaned back with a sigh. "We're making progress, but it's not enough. Dawson's got too much influence with the local authorities. We need to make noise, get attention from outside." Robert nodded, rubbing his tired eyes. "You're right. But how do we do that without putting anyone at risk?" Evelyn's eyes lit up. "A vigil. Peaceful but visible. We'll invite the media, make it impossible to ignore." The idea took root quickly. Within days, plans were underway for a candlelight vigil in front of the courthouse. Flyers were distributed discreetly, and word spread through whispered conversations and late-night meetings. On the night of the vigil, Robert stood at the edge of the gathering crowd, his sheriff's uniform replaced by plain clothes. He watched as people arrived in twos and threes, their faces a mix of determination and fear. Evelyn moved through the group, offering words of encouragement and handing out candles. As the sun set, the crowd grew. Robert estimated there were at least 100 people present, far more than he had dared to hope for. Local news vans had arrived, their cameras capturing the scene. Evelyn stepped up to a makeshift podium, her voice strong as she addressed the crowd and the cameras. "We are here tonight to shine a light on the darkness that has been allowed to fester in our community. For too long we have lived in fear and squalor, our basic rights ignored by those who profit from our misery." As she spoke, Robert scanned the edges of the crowd, alert for any sign of trouble. His gaze fell on a familiar face, Aisha standing near the front, her candle held high. She caught his eye and gave a small nod. Evelyn continued, her words painting a vivid picture of the conditions faced by Dawson's tenants. As she finished, she turned to Aisha. "We have someone here who would like to share her story." Aisha hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward. Her voice shook at first, but grew stronger as she spoke. "My name is Aisha Malik. I've lived in one of Mr. Dawson's buildings for 2 years with my sick mother. We have no running water. The roof leaks. There are rats in the walls. But we stay because we have nowhere else to go." She paused, taking a deep breath. "But we're not alone. Everyone here has a similar story. We're not asking for luxury. We're asking for basic human dignity, for safe, clean homes, for a landlord who sees us as people, not just rent checks." As Aisha spoke, Robert noticed movement at the edge of the crowd. A group of men had arrived, their expressions hostile. He recognized one as the man who had interrupted their meeting. Quietly, he made his way towards them, positioning himself between the newcomers and the vigil. "This is a peaceful gathering," he said firmly, making eye contact with each man. "I suggest you move along." The leader of the group sneered. "You're making a big mistake, Jenkins. Dawson won't forget this." "Neither will we," Robert replied. "Now leave, before I have reason to make this official." For a tense moment, Robert thought the man might try something, but then he jerked his head at his companions, and they melted back into the darkness. When Robert turned back to the vigil, Aisha was finishing her speech. "We're not going to be silent anymore. We're going to fight for our rights, for our homes, for our community, and we're going to win." The crowd erupted in applause and cheers. As the noise died down, Evelyn returned to the podium. "This is just the beginning," she declared. "We have a long fight ahead of us, but together we can make a difference." As the vigil dispersed, Robert made his way to Evelyn and Aisha. "You were both incredible," he said, "but things are going to get tougher from here. Dawson's not going to take this lying down." Evelyn nodded grimly. "We know, but we're ready." The next morning, Robert woke to find the vigil plastered across the front page of the local newspaper. His phone was buzzing with messages, other law enforcement officials from around the county offering support and resources. But as he scrolled through his notifications, one message made his blood run cold. It was from an unknown number. "You've made your choice, Jenkins. Hope you're ready for what comes next." Robert stared at the screen, a mix of anger and determination coursing through him. He had known this wouldn't be easy, but now the reality of what they were up against was sinking in. This wasn't just about one corrupt landlord anymore. They were challenging a whole system that profited from the exploitation of the vulnerable. As he got dressed for work, Robert's resolve hardened. They had taken the first steps in their fight for justice. There would be obstacles, threats, and setbacks. But looking at the faces of Aisha, Evelyn, and all the others who had stood up at the vigil, he knew they couldn't back down now. The fight for justice had truly begun, and Robert Jenkins was ready to see it through, no matter the cost. The days following the vigil were a whirlwind of activity. The local media, energized by the dramatic stories and visuals from the event, began digging deeper into Frank Dawson's real estate empire. Robert found himself fielding calls from reporters, carefully balancing his role as a law enforcement officer with his commitment to the community's cause. One afternoon, as Robert was reviewing incident reports in his office, his deputy knocked on the door. "Sheriff, there's someone here to see you, says it's urgent." Robert looked up, surprised to see Frank Dawson himself walk in. The landlord was a heavy-set man in his 60s, dressed in an expensive suit that seemed at odds with the shabby sheriff's office. "Sheriff Jenkins," Dawson said, his voice oily smooth, "I think it's time we had a chat." Robert gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Mr. Dawson, what can I do for you?" Dawson sat down, his eyes never leaving Robert's face. "You've been causing quite a stir, Sheriff. I'm here to see if we can't come to an understanding." "An understanding?" Robert repeated, his guard up. Dawson leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Let's cut to the chase. I know you think you're doing the right thing, standing up for the little guy and all that, but you're in over your head. I've got friends in high places, Jenkins, friends who can make life very difficult for a small-town sheriff." Robert felt a chill run down his spine, but he kept his face impassive. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Dawson?" The landlord chuckled. "Threatening? No, I'm offering you an opportunity. You're a smart man. You must know that this little crusade of yours is doomed to fail. So why not come out ahead?" With that, Dawson reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope, placing it on the desk between them. "Consider it a donation to the Sheriff's Department. For community outreach programs, of course." Robert stared at the envelope, his mind racing. This was blatant bribery, but if he refused outright, he might lose the chance to gather evidence against Dawson. Carefully, he picked up the envelope. "That's very generous of you, Mr. Dawson. I'll have to discuss this with the county board, of course. Make sure everything's above board." Dawson's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, take your time. But remember, Sheriff, it's always better to have me as a friend than an enemy." After Dawson left, Robert immediately called the state police, reporting the attempted bribe. As he hung up, he realized his hands were shaking. The confrontation had made one thing clear. This fight was far bigger and more dangerous than he had initially thought. Over the next few days, Robert threw himself into the investigation with renewed vigor. He pored over property records, tax documents, and building inspection reports. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge, a web of shell companies, suspicious transactions, and conveniently overlooked violations. But as he dug deeper, Robert began to notice some troubling inconsistencies. Reports that should have been on file were missing. Complaints that had been lodged seemed to vanish into thin air. It was as if someone was actively working to stymie his investigation. His suspicions were confirmed when he received an anonymous tip, a flash drive left on his car windshield. The note attached simply read, "Be careful who you trust." Robert spent a sleepless night reviewing the contents of the drive. What he found made his blood run cold. Financial records, emails, and photos painted a damning picture. Dawson's corruption extended far beyond just his real estate dealings. He had connections with local politicians, judges, and even members of the police force. The next morning, Robert called an emergency meeting with Evelyn and a few other community leaders he trusted implicitly. They gathered in the back room of a local diner, speaking in hushed tones. "It's worse than we thought," Robert explained, laying out what he'd discovered. "Dawson's got half the town in his pocket. That's why nothing's ever been done about the conditions in his buildings. He's been bribing officials for years." Evelyn's face was grim. "So what do we do now? If we can't trust the local authorities, where do we turn?" Robert took a deep breath. "We need to go over their heads. State police, FBI if necessary. But we have to be careful. One wrong move, and Dawson could bury this whole thing." As they discussed their next steps, Robert couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, wondering who he could truly trust. His paranoia proved justified when, a few days later, he was called into the mayor's office. Mayor Thompson was a tall, lean man with a politician's smile and a steel glint in his eye. "Jenkins," he said, gesturing for Robert to sit. "I'll get right to the point. This vendetta against Frank Dawson needs to stop. He's a pillar of our community, a job creator. This witch hunt is bad for business, bad for the town." Robert met the mayor's gaze steadily. With all due respect, sir, I'm conducting a legitimate investigation into numerous complaints and violations. If Mr. Dawson hasn't done anything wrong, he has nothing to worry about. The mayor's smile disappeared. Don't play dumb, Jenkins. You know exactly what you're doing, stirring up trouble where there doesn't need to be any. Consider this an official warning. Drop this investigation or I'll find a sheriff who will. As Robert left the mayor's office, his mind was racing. The threat to his job was clear, but it was more than that. The mayor's intervention confirmed the extent of Dawson's influence. They were going up against not just one corrupt businessman, but an entire system designed to protect the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. That night, as Robert sat at his kitchen table surrounded by files and notes, he felt the weight of the task before him. The corruption ran deep, tentacles reaching into every aspect of the town's governance. Fighting it would mean risking not just his job, but potentially his safety and that of those he cared about. For a moment, doubt crept in. Was it worth it? Could they really hope to change a system so entrenched in corruption? But then he remembered Aisha's face as she spoke at the vigil, the hope in the eyes of the community members who had finally found the courage to stand up for themselves. He thought of the oath he'd taken when he became sheriff, to protect and serve all members of his community. Robert straightened his shoulders, a new determination filling him. The road ahead would be difficult and dangerous, but he knew he couldn't back down now. The confrontation with corruption had begun in earnest, and he was ready to see it through to the end, whatever the cost. In the wake of the mounting threats and the revelation of widespread corruption, Robert Jenkins knew that their fight needed to shift gears. It was no longer enough to simply gather evidence and hope for justice through official channels. They needed to build a movement that could withstand the pressure and intimidation tactics of Dawson and his allies. With this in mind, Robert reached out to Evelyn Martinez to organize another community meeting. This time they chose a different venue, the local community center, a neutral ground that could accommodate a larger crowd. On the night of the meeting, Robert arrived early to help set up. As he arranged chairs in rows, he saw Aisha enter, pushing her mother's wheelchair. The young woman's face was set in a determined expression that had become familiar over the past weeks. "Sheriff Jenkins," she greeted him. "I brought some others with me. Is that okay?" Robert turned to see a group of people filing in behind her. Families, elderly couples, young adults. Many of them he recognized from Dawson's properties, but others were new faces. "Of course," he said, a smile breaking across his face. "The more, the better." As the room filled up, Robert felt a surge of hope. Despite the risks, despite the threats, people were still showing up. They were still fighting. Evelyn called the meeting to order, her voice strong and clear. "Friends, neighbors, we're here tonight because we refuse to be silenced. We refuse to be intimidated. We're here because we believe in justice, in dignity, in the power of community." She went on to outline the challenges they faced, the depth of corruption, the threats to those who spoke out. But instead of despair, her words seemed to ignite a fire in the room. One by one, people stood up to share their stories. A single mother spoke of how she'd been evicted after complaining about black mold in her apartment. An elderly man described how he'd been without heat for 3 winters running. A young couple revealed how they'd been pressured to pay bribes just to get basic repairs done. As the stories poured out, Robert saw something changing in the room. The fear and resignation that had long characterized these residents was giving way to anger, to determination. Aisha stood up, her voice steady. "We've all suffered alone for too long, but we're not alone anymore. We have each other, and together we're stronger than any corrupt landlord or crooked politician." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Robert watched in amazement as people who had been strangers just hours before began to form connections, exchanging phone numbers and making plans. Evelyn seized the moment. "We need to organize," she said. "We need to create a support network. For those facing eviction, for those dealing with unsafe conditions, for those being pressured or threatened. The idea took hold immediately. People began to volunteer, lawyers offering pro bono services, nurses willing to document health issues caused by poor living conditions, tech-savvy youth proposing to set up secure communication channels. Robert stepped forward. "I want you all to know that as long as I'm sheriff, I'll do everything in my power to protect this community, but I also need your help. If you see something suspicious, if you're approached with bribes or threats, don't keep it to yourself. Report it, document it. The more evidence we gather, the stronger our case becomes." As the meeting continued, Robert was struck by the transformation he was witnessing. These people who had been isolated and downtrodden for so long were coming together, forming a united front against the corruption that had plagued their lives. By the end of the night, they had established several working groups, one to handle legal issues, another to document building code violations, a third to coordinate emergency housing for those facing retaliation. As people began to file out, many stopped to shake Robert's hand or offer words of gratitude. The energy in the room was palpable, a mix of determination, hope, and newfound solidarity. Aisha approached him, her mother beside her. "Sheriff," she said, "I want to help more. I've been thinking. I could be a liaison between the community and your office. I speak several languages. I know most of the residents. I could help coordinate, gather information." Robert nodded, impressed by her initiative. "That would be incredibly helpful, Aisha. Thank you." As he watched Aisha move through the crowd, speaking with people, offering encouragement and support, Robert felt a swell of pride. This was what true community looked like. People coming together, supporting each other, fighting for a common cause. The next few weeks saw a flurry of activity. The support network they had established began to bear fruit. When Dawson's men tried to illegally evict a family, a group of neighbors showed up to peacefully prevent it, while others worked to find emergency housing. When threats were made against outspoken residents, others stepped up to ensure they weren't alone and vulnerable. Robert found his office becoming a hub of activity. Aisha proved to be an invaluable asset, her natural leadership abilities and deep community connections helping to coordinate their efforts. One afternoon, as Robert was reviewing a stack of new evidence compiled by the community, Evelyn burst into his office, her face flushed with excitement. "Robert," she said, barely containing her enthusiasm, "you won't believe this. Remember that young couple from the meeting? The ones who were pressured to pay bribes? They managed to record one of Dawson's men trying to extort them. We've got it on tape." Robert leaned forward, his heart racing. This could be the break they needed, hard evidence of criminal activity that couldn't be easily dismissed or covered up. As word of this new evidence spread through the community, it seemed to galvanize everyone. People who had been hesitant to come forward before now felt emboldened. The trickle of complaints and testimonies turned into a flood, but with this increased activity came increased risk. Robert began to notice unmarked cars following him. Aisha reported that some residents had been approached with both threats and bribes to stay quiet. Despite the pressure, the community held firm. They organized watches to protect vulnerable residents. They set up a system to document and report any intimidation attempts. What had started as a scattered group of frustrated tenants had become an organized, determined movement. As Robert stood at his office window one evening, watching the sun set over the town he'd sworn to protect, he reflected on the transformation he'd witnessed. The unity of the community had become their greatest strength, a force that even the deeply entrenched corruption couldn't easily overcome. He knew the fight was far from over. Dawson and his allies wouldn't go down without a fight. But looking at the bustling activity in his office, Aisha coordinating volunteers, Evelyn poring over legal documents, residents coming in to offer new information, Robert felt a surge of hope. They had taken on a system that had seemed unbeatable, and they were holding their ground. The community had found its voice, its strength, and together they were determined to see this fight through to the end. As the community's efforts gained momentum, the pushback from Frank Dawson and his allies intensified. Robert Jenkins found himself walking a tightrope, balancing his official duties as sheriff with his commitment to the grassroots movement he'd helped spark. One morning, Robert arrived at his office to find a stack of complaints on his desk. Not from tenants, but from local business owners. They claimed that the disruptive activities of the tenant group were hurting the town's economy. Robert recognized the tactic for what it was, an attempt to turn public opinion against their cause. As he was reviewing the complaints, his deputy knocked on the door. "Sheriff, there's been an incident at one of Dawson's properties. You might want to check it out yourself." Robert arrived at the scene to find a crowd gathered outside a dilapidated apartment building. Aisha pushed through the onlookers, her face tight with worry. "Sheriff, they're trying to evict the Ramirez family. They have no legal grounds. It's pure retaliation." Inside, Robert found Mr. Ramirez, a middle-aged man standing defiantly in his doorway while two burly men attempted to remove his belongings. Robert recognized one of the men as a former bouncer with a history of assault charges. "Gentlemen," Robert said, his voice carrying authority, "I'm going to need to see an eviction order." The larger of the two men sneered. "We don't need no order. Mr. Dawson owns this building. He says they're out, they're out." Robert stood his ground. "That's not how the law works. Without a court order, this eviction is illegal. I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises immediately." For a tense moment, it seemed the men might resist, but Robert's unwavering stance and the growing crowd of supportive neighbors eventually forced them to back down. As they left, one of them muttered, "This ain't over, Sheriff." The incident marked a turning point. Dawson was no longer content to work through official channels or intimidation tactics. He was now resorting to outright illegal actions. Over the next few days, similar incidents erupted across town. Tenants reported midnight visits from threatening strangers. Accidents began to happen. A fire broke out in one building, miraculously sparing any residents but destroying evidence of code violations. The brakes on Evelyn's car failed, nearly causing a serious accident. The community responded with increased vigilance. They organized round-the-clock watches on vulnerable buildings. Neighbors opened their homes to those facing illegal eviction attempts. Local lawyers volunteered their time to file injunctions and restraining orders. As the tension escalated, Robert found his resources stretched to the breaking point. He was working almost around the clock, responding to incidents, documenting violations, and trying to keep the peace. The stress was taking its toll, and he knew Dawson was counting on him to eventually break under the pressure. One evening, as Robert was leaving a community meeting, he found his path blocked by Mayor Thompson and two members of the town council. "Jenkins," the mayor said, his voice cold, "this has gone on long enough. You're neglecting your duties, stirring up trouble. The council has voted to place you on administrative leave, pending an investigation into your conduct." Robert felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. He'd known this might be coming, but the reality of it was still a shock. "On what grounds?" he managed to ask. "Abuse of power, misuse of resources, interfering with legitimate business operations," the mayor listed off. "Take your pick. Turn in your badge and gun. Deputy Collins will be taking over as interim sheriff." As word of Robert's suspension spread, it sent shockwaves through the community. Many saw it as a clear sign of Dawson's influence and the depth of corruption they were fighting against. That night, an emergency meeting was called at the community center. The room was packed, the air thick with tension and uncertainty. Robert stood before the crowd, feeling the weight of their expectations. "I know this looks bad," he began, his voice steady despite his inner turmoil. "Dawson and his cronies think that by taking away my badge, they'll stop our movement. But they're wrong. This was never about me. It's about all of us, standing together against injustice." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Evelyn stood up, her eyes blazing with determination. "Robert's right. We can't let this setback discourage us. In fact, we need to push harder now. They're resorting to these tactics because they're scared. They know we're close to exposing the whole corrupt system. Aisha joined them at the front of the room. "We've come too far to give up now. So what if Robert's not officially the sheriff anymore? He's still one of us, still fighting for what's right. And now he can do it full-time without having to worry about playing by their rules." The energy in the room shifted, fear and uncertainty giving way to renewed determination. People began to offer suggestions, resources, support. A local reporter volunteered to write an exposé on Robert's suspension. A group of college students offered to organize a peaceful protest. As the meeting progressed, Robert felt a mix of emotions. He was overwhelmed by the community's support, but also acutely aware of the challenges ahead. Without his badge, he no longer had official authority or access to resources, but he also had more freedom to act, to push back against the corruption without fear of professional repercussions. As the meeting was winding down, a commotion outside caught everyone's attention. Robert rushed to the window to see Dawson's men surrounding the building, their faces masked, some wielding bats and chains. "Everyone stay calm," Robert called out, his law enforcement training kicking in. "Aisha, start live streaming this. Evelyn, call every media outlet in the county. The rest of you, stay inside and stay together." Robert stepped outside, alone and unarmed, to face the mob. He could feel the eyes of the community on his back, knew that they were watching, waiting to see if he would falter. "You're trespassing on private property," Robert said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent parking lot. "I suggest you leave immediately." One of the masked men stepped forward. "You don't give orders anymore, Jenkins. You're nothing now. Just another troublemaker who needs to be taught a lesson." Robert stood his ground. "You're right, I'm not the sheriff anymore, but that just means I've got nothing left to lose. So if you want to start something, you'll have to go through me first. And I promise you, I won't go down easy." For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Robert could hear his heart pounding in his ears, could feel sweat trickling down his back. He was acutely aware that if the mob rushed him, there was little he could do to stop them. But then, sirens sounded in the distance. Red and blue lights appeared on the horizon. Someone in the community center must have called 911. The masked men hesitated, looking to their leader. With a curse, he signaled a retreat. As quickly as they had appeared, Dawson's men melted away into the night. As the police cars pulled into the parking lot, the community spilled out of the center, surrounding Robert. He felt hands patting him on the back, heard voices raised in support and relief. In that moment, as he stood surrounded by the people he'd sworn to protect, Robert realized something important. They had reached the height of tension, yes, but they had also reached the height of their unity. Dawson's escalating tactics hadn't broken them. They had only made the community stronger, more determined. The fight was far from over. In fact, the real battle was just beginning. But looking at the faces around him, Aisha's fierce determination, Evelyn's unwavering strength, the courage of every community member who had chosen to stand up rather than back down, Robert knew one thing for certain. They were ready for whatever came next. In the days following the confrontation at the community center, tension in the town reached a fever pitch. Robert Jenkins, now stripped of his official authority, found himself thrust into the role of full-time community organizer. Without the constraints of his badge, he threw himself into the fight with renewed vigor. One morning, as Robert was meeting with Evelyn and Aisha to plan their next move, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Parking garage, level 3, 1 hour. Come alone if you want the truth." Robert stared at the message, his mind racing. It could be a trap, but it could also be the break they'd been waiting for. After a brief discussion with Evelyn and Aisha, he decided to go, but not without precautions. An hour later, Robert cautiously entered the deserted parking garage. On the 3rd level, he found a nervous-looking man in a suit pacing back and forth. Robert recognized him as James Turner, a clerk from the county assessor's office. "Mr. Turner," Robert called out, keeping his distance. "What's this about?" Turner's head snapped up, his eyes darting around nervously. "Jenkins! I can't do this anymore. The lies, the cover-ups, it's eating me alive." Over the next half hour, Turner poured out a story that made Robert's blood run cold. He revealed a complex web of fraud, money laundering, and racketeering that extended far beyond Dawson's slum properties. The corruption reached into City Hall, the police department, even the local courts. "Dawson's just the tip of the iceberg," Turner explained, his voice shaking. "There's a whole network of them, working together to keep this town under their thumb. They've been cooking the books for years, funneling money through shell companies, bribing officials. I've got proof, documents, recordings, everything." Robert's mind was reeling. This was bigger than he had ever imagined. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked. Turner's face crumpled. They went too far. There was a woman, Maria Gonzalez. She was going to testify about the conditions in her building. They made her disappear. I can't be part of this anymore." As Turner handed over a flash drive containing his evidence, Robert felt a mix of emotions: excitement at the breakthrough, fear of the implications, and a grim determination to see this through. Back at the community center, Robert, Evelyn, and Aisha pored over the files Turner had provided. The evidence was damning: detailed financial records showing millions of dollars in bribes and kickbacks, emails discussing how to cover up building violations, even plans for dealing with troublemakers in the community. "This is it," Evelyn breathed, her eyes wide. "This is everything we need to bring them down." Aisha nodded, her face set in determination. "But we need to be careful. If they find out we have this before we can act on it, they'll stop at nothing to silence us." Robert agreed. "We need to get this to someone we can trust, someone with the authority to act on it. This is too big for local law enforcement." After much discussion, they decided to reach out to a contact Robert had in the state police. But as they were making plans, Aisha's phone buzzed with an alert from one of their community watchers. Dawson's men were on the move, headed towards the homes of several outspoken community members. "They know," Robert said grimly. "Somehow they know we've got something. They're trying to scare us into silence." Evelyn stood up, her jaw set. "Then we don't give them the chance. We need to move now." What followed was a night of frantic activity. As Dawson's thugs spread through the neighborhood, the community network sprang into action. Families were quietly evacuated, moved to safe houses. Evidence was copied and distributed to trusted individuals. A plan that had been meant to unfold over days was compressed into hours. Robert found himself coordinating from the community center, directing their efforts like a general in a war room. Aisha was out in the field, helping with evacuations and keeping their people calm. Evelyn worked the phones, calling in every favor and connection she had. As dawn broke, Robert received word that his contact from the state police had arrived with a team of investigators. But at the same moment, Aisha called with alarming news. Dawson himself was headed to the community center with a group of armed men. "He's making his move," Robert realized. "He thinks if he can get to us, he can still contain this." Robert knew they needed more time. The state investigators needed to secure the evidence, to start making arrests before Dawson and his allies could cover their tracks or flee. In that moment, Robert made a decision. "Aisha, get everyone out of here. Take the evidence to the state police. I'll stay and deal with Dawson." "But Robert," Aisha began to protest. "No arguments," Robert cut her off. "This is our one shot. I'll buy you as much time as I can." As Aisha reluctantly agreed and began to coordinate the evacuation, Robert stood alone in the community center. He could hear cars pulling up outside, knew that in moments he would be facing Dawson and his men. But as he steeled himself for the confrontation, something unexpected happened. The door burst open and people began to flood in. Dozens of community members armed with nothing more than their presence and their determination. Evelyn was at the front, her eyes blazing. "You didn't think we'd let you face this alone, did you?" Before Robert could respond, Dawson entered, flanked by his thugs. He surveyed the crowded room, his face twisted in a sneer. "Well, isn't this touching? Your last stand, Jenkins. You're finished, you know. You and your little band of troublemakers." Robert stepped forward, placing himself between Dawson and the community. "It's over, Frank. The state police are on their way. They have everything. The financial records, the emails, all of it. Your whole operation is about to come crashing down." For a moment, Dawson's composure slipped, fear flashing in his eyes. But he quickly recovered, his hand moving towards his jacket. "You're bluffing. And even if you're not, you won't live to see it." But as Dawson reached for what Robert assumed was a weapon, something remarkable happened. The community members who had been standing silently began to raise their phones. Dozens of cameras were suddenly trained on Dawson and his men, live-streaming the confrontation to the world. Aisha's voice rang out from the back of the room. "It's done, Robert. The evidence is with the state police. They're making arrests all over town." Dawson's face drained of color. His men, seeing the cameras and sensing the shift in power, began to back away. In that moment, Robert saw the realization dawn in Dawson's eyes. It was over. The years of corruption, of unchecked power, had come to an end. And it hadn't been brought down by any one person, but by the united strength of a community that had finally said, "Enough." As the sound of sirens filled the air and blue lights flashed outside, Robert felt a profound sense of triumph. They had done it. Against all odds, they had taken on a corrupt system and won. But even as he allowed himself to savor the victory, Robert knew that this was just the beginning. They had won the battle, but the war for justice and dignity was far from over. There would be trials, rebuilding, hard work ahead to heal the wounds inflicted on their community. Yet looking at the faces around him, proud, determined, united, Robert felt a surge of hope. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The turning point had come, and there was no going back. In the days following Dawson's arrest, a sense of cautious optimism spread through the community. The state police had set up a temporary headquarters in town, methodically working through the mountain of evidence and making arrests. City officials, police officers, and business leaders were being led away in handcuffs, their crimes exposed to the light of day. Robert Jenkins, though no longer wearing a badge, found himself at the center of the investigation. His detailed knowledge of the town and its players made him an invaluable asset to the state police. But even as progress was being made, Robert couldn't shake a feeling of unease. Something didn't feel right. His suspicions were confirmed when Aisha burst into the community center one afternoon, her face pale with worry. "Robert, we have a problem. Some of the key documents are missing from the evidence. The ones that tied everything together, that proved the extent of the corruption. Without them, a lot of these arrests might not stick." Robert's mind raced. The implications were clear. Someone on the inside was still working to protect the corrupt network. The final confrontation was yet to come. Evelyn, who had been listening nearby, spoke up. "We need to find those documents, and we need to do it fast before whoever took them has a chance to destroy them." Robert nodded grimly. "Agreed. But we need to be smart about this. Whoever's behind this, they're desperate. That makes them dangerous." Over the next few hours, Robert, Aisha, and Evelyn worked to piece together the puzzle. They reviewed security logs, interviewed community members, and pored over the remaining evidence. Slowly, a picture began to emerge. "It has to be someone with access to the evidence lockup," Robert mused. "Someone who knew exactly what to take." Aisha's eyes widened in realization. "What about that new state investigator, Davies? He transferred in right after the arrests started, and he's been asking a lot of questions about our evidence." Robert's jaw clenched. "It fits. He could have been planted by whoever's left of Dawson's network. We need to move, now." As night fell, Robert, Aisha, and a small team of trusted community members put their plan into action. They had tracked Davies to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. Robert suspected he was meeting with whoever was left of Dawson's organization, preparing to hand over or destroy the evidence. As they approached the warehouse, Robert addressed the group. "Remember, our priority is recovering those documents. We're not here to fight if we can avoid it, but be prepared for anything." They split into teams surrounding the building. Robert, Aisha, and Evelyn took the main entrance. As they crept closer, they could hear voices from inside, angry, argumentative. "This wasn't the deal!" They recognized Davies' voice. "I got you the documents, but this is too far. People are asking questions. It's only a matter of time before—" He was cut off by another voice, cold and familiar. Robert's blood ran cold as he recognized it. Mayor Thompson. "You'll do as you're told," the mayor snarled. "We've come too far to back out now. Once these documents are destroyed, their case falls apart. We can weather this storm, but only if we stick to the plan." Robert signaled to the others. They had to act now. Taking a deep breath, he kicked in the door. The scene inside froze. Davies and Mayor Thompson stood over a barrel, documents in hand. Several of Dawson's former enforcers were scattered around the room, looking uncertain. "It's over," Robert declared, his voice steady. "Put down the documents and step away from the barrel." For a moment, no one moved. Then chaos erupted. One of Dawson's men lunged for Robert, while another made a grab for the documents. Aisha intercepted him, her years of standing up to bullies serving her well as she grappled for the papers. Evelyn, showing a surprising burst of speed for her age, snatched a lighter from the mayor's hand just as he was about to set fire to the barrel. "Not today," she growled. Robert found himself locked in a struggle with Davies. The corrupt investigator was younger, but Robert's years of experience and righteous determination gave him an edge. They crashed into a stack of crates, sending them tumbling. As the fight raged on, Robert saw Mayor Thompson making a break for a side door, a stack of documents clutched to his chest. "Aisha!" Robert yelled, still grappling with Davies. "The mayor!" Aisha, having subdued her opponent, took off after Thompson. She chased him out into the night, her feet pounding on the pavement. The mayor was fast, desperation lending him speed, but Aisha was faster. With a final burst of energy, she tackled him to the ground. Back in the warehouse, Robert finally managed to overpower Davies, slamming him against the wall. "It's done," he panted. "Give it up." As if on cue, sirens split the night air. The state police, alerted by the rest of their team, had arrived. In the aftermath, as the warehouse was swarmed by legitimate law enforcement, Robert, Aisha, and Evelyn stood together, battered but unbowed. The missing documents were secure, the last vestiges of Dawson's corrupt network exposed. "We did it," Aisha breathed, a note of wonder in her voice. "We really did it." Evelyn nodded, a tired but satisfied smile on her face. "It's not every day you get to take down a corrupt mayor and save your town." Robert looked at them both, feeling a profound sense of pride and gratitude. "We all did it. Every member of this community who stood up, who refused to be silenced. This victory belongs to all of us." As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, Robert knew that this truly was the final confrontation. The corruption that had plagued their town for so long had been rooted out, exposed to the light of day. There would be challenges ahead, of course. Rebuilding trust, reforming institutions, healing the wounds inflicted by years of exploitation and neglect. But looking at Aisha and Evelyn, at the community members who had rallied to their cause, Robert felt a surge of hope. They had faced the darkness together, and together they had triumphed. Whatever the future held, Robert knew one thing for certain: their community would face it united, stronger than ever before. As they walked away from the warehouse, leaving the state police to process the scene, Robert felt as though a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The final confrontation was over. Now the real work of rebuilding could begin. In the weeks following the dramatic confrontation at the warehouse, the town of Millbrook underwent a transformation. The arrests of Mayor Thompson, Investigator Davies, and the remaining members of Dawson's network sent shockwaves through the community. As the dust settled, the true extent of the corruption was revealed, and the process of rebuilding began. Robert Jenkins, though still without his badge, found himself at the center of these efforts. His tireless work and unwavering integrity had earned him the trust and respect of both the community and the state authorities overseeing the cleanup. One sunny morning, Robert stood before a crowd gathered in front of the town hall. The building, once a symbol of corruption, was now draped with banners proclaiming a new era of transparency and justice. "Friends, neighbors," Robert began, his voice carrying across the square. "We're here today not just to celebrate a victory, but to commit ourselves to the work that lies ahead. We've torn down the old system, but now we have the responsibility and the opportunity to build something better in its place." The crowd listened intently as Robert outlined the changes already underway. A Citizens Oversight Committee had been established to monitor city government. The police department was undergoing a complete restructuring, with new training programs and accountability measures. Dawson's properties were being transferred to a community land trust, ensuring affordable housing for years to come. As Robert spoke, he saw faces in the crowd that had become familiar over the course of their struggle. There was Mrs. Ramirez, who had stood firm in the face of illegal eviction attempts. Mr. Chen, whose meticulous record-keeping had provided crucial evidence. Young Jamal, whose tech skills had helped them secure and distribute information. But it was Aisha who caught Robert's eye as he concluded his speech. She stood near the front, her head held high, a symbol of the resilience and determination that had seen their community through its darkest hours. "The road ahead won't be easy," Robert said, his gaze sweeping the crowd. "But if we've learned anything from this experience, it's that when we stand together, there's nothing we can't overcome. This is our community, and together we'll make it a place we can all be proud to call home." The applause that followed was thunderous, a cathartic release of emotion from a community that had been through so much. As the crowd dispersed, Aisha made her way to Robert's side. "Nice speech," she said with a smile. "But you forgot to mention the best part." Robert raised an eyebrow. "Oh, and what's that?" Aisha's smile widened. "The fact that you're running for mayor in the special election next month." Robert chuckled, shaking his head. The idea had been proposed by community members, eager to see leadership they could trust. He'd resisted at first, but the overwhelming support had eventually won him over. "Still not sure I'm cut out for politics," he admitted. "Cut out for it or not, you're what this town needs," Evelyn chimed in, joining them. "Someone who remembers what it means to serve the community, not just the powerful." As they walked away from the town hall, Robert found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. The struggles, the setbacks, the moments of despair when it had seemed like the corruption was too entrenched to ever root out. But with each step, he was reminded of the victory they had achieved. The streets were cleaner, the buildings in better repair. People walked with their heads held high, no longer afraid to meet their neighbors' eyes or speak out against injustice. They passed by the community center, now a hub of activity. Through the windows, Robert could see residents attending workshops on civic engagement, legal clinics offering pro bono services, and youth programs providing new opportunities for the next generation. "You know," Aisha said, following his gaze, "I've been thinking about going to law school." Robert turned to her, surprised but pleased. "Really? That's wonderful, Aisha. You'd make an excellent advocate for the community." She nodded, her expression determined. "This whole experience, it showed me the power of understanding the law, of using it to protect people's rights. I want to be part of making sure what happened here never happens again, not just in Millbrook, but anywhere." As they continued their walk, more community members approached them. Some offered congratulations, others shared concerns or ideas for further improvements. Robert listened to each one, struck by the energy and engagement that now characterized their town. They ended up at the small park where Robert had first encountered Aisha doing laundry in the alley. The space had been transformed. New playground equipment gleamed in the sunlight, community gardens bloomed with vegetables and flowers, and a mural depicting the town's journey from corruption to renewal covered one wall. "Sometimes I still can't believe it," Evelyn said softly, taking in the scene. "How far we've come." Robert nodded, understanding the sentiment. "It's a testament to the strength of this community, to every person who refused to give up, who believed that change was possible." As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the park, families started to gather for a community potluck. The aroma of various dishes filled the air, mingling with the sound of laughter and conversation. Robert watched as Aisha joined a group of young volunteers setting up tables, her natural leadership skills evident in the way she organized the efforts. Evelyn had been drawn into an animated discussion with some of the elder residents, no doubt planning the next community initiative. In that moment, Robert felt a profound sense of pride and gratitude. The victory they had achieved went far beyond the removal of corrupt officials or the exposure of criminal activities. The true victory was in the renewed spirit of the community, the sense of empowerment and unity that now pervaded every aspect of life in Millbrook. As he joined his neighbors at the potluck, sharing food and stories, Robert knew that this was just the beginning. There would be challenges ahead, new battles to fight, ongoing work to maintain the progress they had made. But looking around at the faces of his community, faces now filled with hope and determination, he had no doubt that they would face whatever came next together. The night wore on, the park filled with the warmth of community and the promise of a brighter future. And as Robert sat among the people he had fought alongside, he realized that this moment of unity, of shared purpose and hope, this was the true victory. A victory not just for Millbrook, but for the very idea of what a community could be when its members stood together in the face of injustice. The corrupt system had been dismantled, yes, but more importantly, it had been replaced by something stronger, more resilient. A community united in its commitment to justice, transparency, and the well-being of all its members. And that, Robert knew, was a victory that would endure. As weeks turned into months, Millbrook settled into a new rhythm. Under Robert Jenkins' leadership as the newly elected mayor, the town was experiencing a renaissance. Community initiatives flourished, transparency in government became the norm, and a sense of pride permeated the once downtrodden neighborhoods. One crisp autumn morning, Robert sat in his office at City Hall, reviewing proposals for a new affordable housing project. A knock at the door interrupted his concentration. "Come in," he called out, looking up to see Aisha entering, her face etched with concern. "Robert, we have a problem," she said without preamble. "I've been going through some old files as part of my internship at the DA's office, and I found something disturbing." Robert leaned forward, his brow furrowing. "What is it, Aisha?" She placed a folder on his desk, her hands shaking slightly. "It's about Frank Dawson. He wasn't working alone. There's evidence of a larger network, spanning several cities. Millbrook was just one piece of a much bigger puzzle." As Robert pored over the documents Aisha had brought, a chill ran down his spine. Bank statements, emails, and coded messages pointed to a sprawling criminal enterprise that extended far beyond their small town. Millbrook had been a testing ground, a proof of concept for a system of corruption and exploitation that was being replicated across the state. "This is bigger than we ever imagined," Robert muttered, his mind racing. "If this is true, then everything we've accomplished here could be at risk. They won't want their larger operation exposed." Aisha nodded grimly. "That's not all. I've noticed some strange things happening around town. People watching me, following me. I thought I was being paranoid, but now—" Robert stood up, his jaw set. "We need to act fast. Get Evelyn and meet me at the community center in an hour. And Aisha," Be careful." As Aisha left, Robert made a series of quick phone calls. He reached out to his contacts in the state police, alerted trusted members of the city council, and put the local police chief on high alert. If they were going to face this new threat, they would need all the allies they could get. An hour later, Robert, Aisha, and Evelyn huddled in the back room of the community center, speaking in hushed tones. "So what's our move?" Evelyn asked, her voice tense. "We can't let them undo everything we fought for." Robert ran a hand through his hair, his mind working overtime. "We need to gather more evidence, build an airtight case, but we also need to protect ourselves and the community. They're going to come at us hard once they realize we're onto them." As they discussed strategy, a commotion outside caught their attention. Robert moved to the window, his heart sinking at what he saw. A group of unfamiliar men in suits were approaching the center, their demeanor unmistakably hostile. "They're here," he said quietly. "Aisha, take the back exit. Get those files to my contact at the state police. Evelyn, start activating our community network. We're going to need everyone on this." Aisha hesitated. "What about you?" Robert managed a grim smile. "I'll buy you some time. Go now." As Aisha and Evelyn slipped out the back, Robert straightened his tie and walked out to meet the approaching men. He recognized one of them, a state senator who had always seemed a little too polished, a little too smooth. "Mayor Jenkins," the senator called out, his smile not reaching his eyes. "We need to talk." What followed was a tense confrontation. The senator, dropping all pretense of civility, made it clear that Millbrook's interference in larger affairs would no longer be tolerated. Veiled threats were made against Robert, his friends, and the community at large. But as the confrontation escalated, something unexpected happened. People began to emerge from nearby houses and businesses. They formed a silent circle around Robert and the outsiders, a clear message of support and defiance. The senator's smile faltered. "You don't know what you're dealing with, Jenkins. This is bigger than your little town." Robert stood his ground, bolstered by the presence of his community. "Maybe so, but you don't know what you're dealing with either. This little town has already taken down one corrupt system. We're not afraid to do it again." As if on cue, sirens sounded in the distance. The state police, alerted by Aisha, were on their way. The senator and his associates, realizing they were outmaneuvered, beat a hasty retreat. In the days that followed, Millbrook once again found itself at the center of a storm. But this time, they were prepared. The evidence Aisha had uncovered, combined with the community's unwavering support, sparked a statewide investigation that began to unravel the larger criminal network. It wasn't easy. There were threats, attempted bribes, and moments of doubt. But the people of Millbrook, hardened by their previous struggle, stood firm. They had learned the power of unity, of standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. As the investigation progressed, more communities came forward with their own stories of corruption and exploitation. What had started in Millbrook grew into a movement, a demand for accountability and justice that swept across the state. Months later, Robert stood once again before his community, this time joined by leaders from other towns and cities. They were there to announce the creation of a statewide task force dedicated to rooting out corruption and protecting vulnerable communities. "What we've accomplished here is just the beginning," Robert said, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "We've shown that when people stand together, when they refuse to be silenced or intimidated, real change is possible. But our work isn't done. There will always be those who seek to exploit and oppress. Our job is to remain vigilant, to continue fighting for justice, not just for ourselves, but for all those who don't yet have the strength to fight for themselves." As he looked out at the sea of faces, not just from Millbrook now, but from across the state, Robert felt a profound sense of hope. The final twist in their story hadn't been an ending, but a new beginning. They had uncovered a larger fight, a bigger injustice, but in doing so, they had also discovered a larger community of allies. Aisha, standing nearby, caught his eye and smiled. She was heading off to law school soon, determined to continue the fight in the courtrooms and corridors of power. Evelyn, her energy seemingly inexhaustible, was already organizing community leaders from other towns, sharing Millbrook's experiences and strategies. As the crowd dispersed, Robert took a moment to reflect on the journey that had brought them to this point. From a chance encounter in a dark alley to a statewide movement for justice, it had been a path filled with challenges, dangers, and unexpected turns. But through it all, the strength of community, the power of people standing together for what was right, had seen them through. The final twist, it turned out, wasn't an ending at all. It was an invitation to a larger struggle, a bigger stage. But as Robert looked at the determined faces of his friends and neighbors, he knew they were ready for whatever came next. The story of Millbrook, of a small community that stood up to corruption and won, was no longer just their story. It had become a beacon of hope, a call to action for others to stand up, to fight back, to believe in the power of united communities. As the sun set on another day in Millbrook, Robert Jenkins, once a small-town sheriff and now a leader in a growing movement for justice, knew that their greatest challenges and their greatest victories still lay ahead. But whatever came, they would face it as they had faced everything else, together, united and unafraid.